Joining me here for our Training Tuesday. Glad that you could be with me this evening. My name is Shelby Abbott, and I will be talking with you this evening about 4 simple ways to make evangelism less weird. This is our third Training Tuesday, and I'm very excited to see what the Lord is going to be working through this evening. I'm excited that you're logging on because obviously I believe that evangelism is very important, and I admire your heart for being here with me this evening. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Shelby Abbott. I've been on staff for 17 years. This summer is 17 years. I've been a Christian for 20 years. And one of the major reasons that I came on staff with Crew is because I believe this organization pushes the envelope when it comes to evangelism. We really care about the Great Commission. We care about talking about our faith, and I wanted to be a part of something so important. So as we're together this evening, I would love it if you would post some pictures of yourself, maybe watching this online, and add the hashtag SummerConnect16. SummerConnect16 on Instagram, Twitter, whatever you guys are hanging out online, whatever social media that you're doing. And yeah, I'd love to kind of connect with you guys and see if you're enjoying this evening as well. Post those pictures. And then, of course, join us again on Thursday. Catch Summer Connect Live on Thursday. We'll be together logging on online and hear some more great content from the scriptures. So let me dive in. Again, this is 4 simple ways to make evangelism less weird. And hopefully this will be very practical, but also helpful for you when you think about communicating your faith with the people who are in your natural circles of influence. Let me start by saying that what we as Christians commonly lack in our approach to evangelism is common sense. Sharing your faith really doesn't have to be difficult or overwhelming, but we allow it to be because of what we believe about what others will believe about us. I'm reminded of a comment that the comedian Jim Gaffigan once said when he said, does anything make you feel more uncomfortable than some stranger going, I'd like to talk to you about Jesus? And I think that little joke that he makes about people talking to others about Christ really has forced Christians into a corner and made them afraid to communicate with others about what we believe about the most important person in our life, who is Jesus. So these are 4 simple ways to make it less weird for you. Let's start with this. It's really just learning about communication. Communication is super important to me. I was a comm minor back in college, and I've been involved in creative communication since I've been on staff for many, many years. I love the importance that many in Crew place on communication. And excuse me, one of the things I wanted to talk to you about is something I learned in college, really. And so it's kind of this communication 101 principle. When you are wanting to talk with someone about a certain idea, and for example, we're going to use here is obviously the purity of the gospel message, what it means for someone to come to know Christ in a personal way. That is an idea in your head, or a thought in your head, the purity of the gospel message. When you want to talk to someone about it, it is your idea in your head, and then it has to go through a series of steps in order to be understood by the person that you're talking to. So it starts out as an idea, number 1. Number 2, it passes through your grid, which is basically your way of thinking about things, your way of processing information, your way of analyzing content. So it's an idea, it passes through your grid, and then you communicate it. And as you communicate it, you obviously say it in the way that you're used to communicating with all of the things that are normal to you. You communicate it, and then number 4, it passes through a thing called noise. Now, noise could be various amounts of things. It can actually be literal audio noise around you, people talking, that kind of stuff, traffic noise in the background, music playing in the speakers above the table where you're sitting or whatever. Or it could be noise in terms of like distractions. Maybe there's people walking by your table. Maybe there's someone behind my shoulder as you're talking to me, and you're distracted by that person instead. Okay, so that's noise, the fourth one. After it goes, your message travels through that noise, it is received by the person you're talking to. It has to pass through their grid, which is their way of thinking and processing information. And then ultimately it becomes their idea or their thought. So it's your idea 1, passes through your grid 2, you communicate it 3, it passes through noise 4, they receive it 5, it passes through their grid 6, and then it becomes their idea or thought number 7. And ideally here, when it comes to the communication principle, you would like your idea number 1 to be equal to their idea number 7. You want those things to be as identical as possible, and especially when it comes to content, communicating content when it comes to the gospel. We want people to understand the purity of the gospel, what it really means, about how Jesus has saved us from eternal condemnation. So that's kind of the communication 101. What's not taught, obviously, in schools is that the overarching kind of umbrella over all of this is the fact that the Holy Spirit is, of course, involved, and the Holy Spirit is responsible for leading people to himself. So we want to do our best to make number 1 our idea, number 7 their idea, and of course, considering the Holy Spirit, what can we do to alleviate any kind of distractions or things that kind of get in the way from them understanding what the purity of the gospel is? There's 3 different ways that I think people communicate a message like the gospel. And number 1, a way of communicating is self-centered, meaning we're usually very concerned about what other people think about us in the process of communicating the gospel, sharing the gospel with someone. We're very distracted by, are they going to think I'm weird? Do they think I'm stupid by telling them this? And so we're very kind of concerned with what they believe about us. And so we can be very self-centered when we communicate the gospel. Another way of communicating is message-centered. Message-centered is really kind of the way that people shared the gospel back in the mid to late 90s. It was just all about getting through the content. I went through a training one time where someone told me, if someone has a question in the middle of your gospel presentation, go ahead and stop them and say, I'd love to get to your question, but let me get through this first, and we'll come back to that later on. So you're very message-centered. You want to get through the points of the gospel, make sure they understand what's being communicated, maybe in a thing like a Knowing God Personally booklet or some sort of like illustration that communicates the gospel. So there's self-centered, there's message-centered, and then there's others-centered. And that's really being intentional about making sure that you're reading that person correctly, you're understanding their body language, if they're getting things, you're reading their facial expressions, if they're like confused or if they kind of like taken aback by something that you say. You really try to be intentional in saying, does that make sense? You want to pause often. You want to leave room for questions. You tailor the message of the gospel to them. Now, there's a difference between tailoring things and watering things down. We're not talking about changing the message of the gospel or watering it down at all. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that we want to make sure that they understand it in the best way that they can. So we're understanding cultural norms. We're understanding the environment that they're coming from. Again, we're asking them lots of questions in the middle of things to make sure that they understand what the message of Scripture communicates when it talks about knowing God in a personal way. So we talk about communication. We can be self-centered, we can be message-centered, we can be others-centered. And I think any given Christian fluctuates between those 3 ways of communicating the gospel. But ultimately, we really where we want to rest is in others-centered. We want to be sensitive to who people are and how the gospel fits into their lives. Because really, it's not about fitting into their lives. It's about their lives fitting into the gospel. We want to make sure that they understand that. The truth is, though, we often as human beings value what people think about us so much that we are very self-centered when we communicate the gospel. We're not other-centered. But the truth is, you cannot live a life God has called you to if you're driven by what other people think of you. And people struggle with this in biblical times as well. John chapter 12, verses 42 and 43 says, "Yet at the same time, many, even among the leaders, believed in him being Jesus. But because of the Pharisees, they would not openly acknowledge their faith for fear they would be put out of the synagogue, for they loved human praise more than praise from God." Now, undoubtedly, this will be a challenge for you and for me for the rest of my life. I will want praise from people more than I will want praise from God. And when you refuse to share your faith because of your desire to please people more than God, what we're essentially saying is that my reputation is more important than their eternal salvation. And when we think through that framework of, well, I really care more about myself right now in this moment than I care about them eternally, it's a great motivator for me to be others-centered and to talk with them about what the gospel means to them and how important it is for their salvation. Galatians chapter 1, verse 10 says, "Am I now trying to win the approval of human beings or of God? Or am I trying to please people? If I were still trying to please people, I would not be a servant of Christ." We really want to please God. We do not necessarily want to please people when it comes to sharing our faith. And Romans 1:16 says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation for everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek." So communication, it's really about understanding it and being other-centered when we talk to people, and that will help us in the process of sharing our faith and make evangelism a little less weird. All right, number 2. So that was the first one, communication. Number 2 is something that Jill talked about a couple of weeks ago. She mentioned it last time, the idea of coming up with a top 5 list. A top 5 list is creating a list of the top 5 people in your natural circle of influence. It could be anyone from family, friends, roommates, people you sit next to in class, the people you are in an intramural sports team with, the people you see at the gym, people you see at the dining hall, just kind of a professor, anyone you run into on a pretty consistent basis. Creating a top 5 list of those people in your life that you eventually want to communicate the gospel with. It's a great thing to do because creating a top 5 list is intentional. We use the word intentional a lot in crew circles, but there's a reason for that. And it's because I believe that a life lived intentionally is a life with great purpose, a life that submits itself to God's great commission when Jesus commands us to go. As a life lived intentionally. It's proactive, it's faith-filled, and it's a tangible illustration of trust that God will direct me as I move forward. Living intentionally is the opposite of living passively, where someone just kind of sits back and waits for things to happen to them. Jesus lived a life of great intentionality, and we should emulate that. So a top 5 list is a great way to begin the process of living intentionally when it comes to evangelism, wanting to share our faith. So create a list of the top 5 people, like I mentioned. Pray for those people on that top 5 list. Move toward those people and create intentional conversation with them. As we do that, God will bend your heart toward them and generate compassion for them in a way that maybe you've never had before. So that's a simple little tip. You can pray for your top 5 lists and then say, eventually I want to communicate my faith with these people who are in my life. So number 1 is communication. Number 2 is creating a top 5 list. And number 3 is this thing from the book of Colossians chapter 4 that's talking about making the most of every opportunity. Colossians 4:5 says, "Walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of the time." When I think about this verse in particular, I think about my brother-in-law, who actually tragically, just a couple months after I was married, ended up committing suicide. I got a horrible phone call from my sister telling me that Eric, my brother-in-law, had shot himself and committed suicide. And when I got that news, obviously I was very struck by it. I was very saddened, and I mourned deeply for my brother-in-law. However, I will say in the same breath that I really only interacted with him twice. I live on the East Coast. My brother-in-law and sister at the time live in California. And so I'd only seen my brother-in-law just a few months previous at my wedding, when he came to my wedding. And then the only other time that I'd seen Eric was at this time before I got married, when he and my sister had traveled out to the East Coast and visited all of us at my mom and dad's house. And when I got the news of his death, I immediately flashed back to this conversation I had with Eric the first time I met him at my parents' house. And it was an interesting scenario. My brother-in-law and my sister are not believers. They didn't know Jesus. I remember this conversation that I had with him when I met him at my parents' house. Now, I was walking down the stairs in my parents' house, and Eric was sitting on the couch in the living room. I walked into the living room and sat down, and Eric and my sister were both very much into tattoos. They have a lot of ink on their skin. And so I sat down across from Eric on the couch, and I'd seen, he had his shirt off, seen a bunch of tattoos all over his body, including these very unique tattoos of cartoon devil women that were tattooed on the front of his body and on his arms and then on his back going down as well. Now, when I saw the tattoos, I immediately recognized them, of these like very sexually promiscuous tattoos tattooed on his body. And so when I sat down with him, that first conversation I had with him, I was like, hey, are those tattoos from the band Lords of Acid? And when I asked that, his mouth like visibly opened in surprise, because he knew I was a missionary on staff with Crew. And he was like, how do you know what these are on my body? Now, the reason I knew what they were is because, flashback to my freshman year of college, I lived next door to two guys named Colin and Drew, who were these very unique individuals who were into a lot of weird stuff. And I befriended them after I became a Christian, and I wanted to intentionally move toward them and get to know them. And so Colin and Drew were into a lot of weird things. They decorated their rooms with things like German gas masks. They listened to some crazy music, and they were into weird shows that didn't seem like they would be into. But I befriended them, and I spent time with them, and they were really into this band called Lords of Acid. Now, before you Google it and look it up, which I don't recommend that you do, which now that I said that, you're probably all going to do, it's a very, very inappropriate, sexually promiscuous band of mostly women, if not all women, who sing about very sexually promiscuous things. But because I befriended Colin and Drew, they had showed me the CDs, and the CDs of this band, the cover art were these cartoon devil women that were specific to that band. Now, because I was intentional with Colin and Drew, I knew many years later, when I sat next to my brother-in-law for the first time, who this band was and what this art on his skin represented. And because I knew about the band Lords of Acid with my brother Eric, he was very open in that conversation to listening to me talk with him about spiritual things. That was the only spiritual conversation I had with him. I did share the gospel with him. He never indicated accepting Christ when I was with him. But when I found out, again, that he had killed himself, I flashed back to that conversation. I thanked God that I knew Colin and Drew my freshman year of college, and I praised him that I made the most of every opportunity that I could with my brother-in-law before he ended his life. Colossians 4, 5, and 6 talks about making the most of every opportunity. It talks about being wise toward outsiders. It talks about gracious and salty speech. It talks about living your life with intentionality. And that's really important that we do that with the top 5 list that we've made, or the people that are in our lives who don't know Jesus. basically what this is calling us to do is to be around non-believers. It's very easy for Christians to pull away and just spend time with Christians. And God calls us to live outside of that Christian bubble, that Christian environment. About a year after I became a Christian, a year and a half after I became a Christian, I realized the end of my sophomore year, just before my junior year at Virginia Tech, that all of my friends, pretty much all of my friends, were Christians. And I said, I gotta change this. I gotta be different. I gotta incorporate non-believers into my life. So I needed money at the same time. So I intentionally got a job on campus at a place called the Hokie Grill that had a Chick-fil-A Express. And so I got a job at the Chick-fil-A Express working with non-believer college students and locals from Southwest Virginia, and I loved it. I befriended those people. I cared about them. They knew where I stood when it came to the gospel. But because I befriended them and I cared about them and asked them questions while we were working, making chicken sandwiches and scooping fries and making nugget boxes, they began to trust me. And so they invited me out to their parties. I volunteered to be the designated driver at their drinking parties. I went to my coworkers' sports games, and I even went at the end of one of my friend's senior year. She was a fashion designer, and her senior project, her final project, was this fashion show. So I went to this fashion show, and I was there for her, and it was like a great testament to being around non-believers, caring for them. I shared the gospel multiple times with my coworkers. No one ever indicated decision to accept Christ in their life, but they knew where I stood. And so many years after they knew me, I'm hopeful that they've looked back when they run across someone else who knows Jesus and they go, you know what? I used to work with this little guy at Chick-fil-A when I was a college student, and he was our designated driver, and he'd always play the guitar at our parties and have fun with us. And he came and was there for us. So maybe the gospel might advance with them in their life later on. Be around non-believers. Make the most of every opportunity, because you may not get second chances like I did not with my brother-in-law. Okay. So number 1, communication. Number 2, create a top 5 list. Number 3, make the most of every opportunity. And 4th and finally, learn how to share your testimony. Another way of putting it is learn how to share the story of how God has changed your life. Great training on this is 6 quick principles about how to share your story. All right. Number 1, keep it short. When you're sharing your story, your testimony about how you came to know Jesus in a personal way, don't be longer than 2.5 to 3 minutes, especially if you have an opportunity like a public platform or something like that. Anything longer than 3 minutes will begin to lose short attention spans. So keep it short. All right. Number 2, have a theme. The theme of my testimony or story is performance, because I struggled with that my entire life, of trying to please my parents, or my teachers, or even God. And so if you have one theme in your story, you might have multiple themes in your life, but if you boil it down just to one, it helps the listener walk away with just one main idea. It helps them to understand your story a little bit easier. So keep it short, have a theme. Number 3, clearly present the gospel. Gentlemen, when you propose to a woman and you give her an engagement ring, it must have a diamond in it. The gospel is the diamond in the engagement ring of your story. Without it, it's just a piece of metal. All right. It is a tragedy when I hear someone present their testimony and they don't clearly present the gospel in it, because a testimony without a clear gospel presentation is not a testimony. It's really important that you talk about how someone can come to know Jesus in a personal way when you give your testimony. And it can be very quick, very just 1 or 2 sentences. When it comes to the point in my testimony, when I share the gospel, I talk about the January of my second semester of my freshman year, when I pulled out this little booklet from my wallet, and I read through that 4-point presentation that said that God loved me and created me to know him personally, but I was sinful and separated from him. I rebelled against him, that Jesus Christ was the only provision for the penalty of my sin, and that I needed to accept him into my life. There it is, the gospel presentation. It doesn't have to be anything longer than that, but you must include it in your testimony. Or like I said, it's not really a testimony. So keep it short, have a theme, clearly present the gospel. Number 4, it's a thing I like to call no Christianese, or no insider language. Christianese is that dialogue that we use in the Christian world that makes sense to people who have been in a crew movement or in a church for a while, but it's a dialogue that really makes no sense to people outside of the Christian environment. I'm talking about words like sanctification, reconciled, justification, even terms like walk with God or quiet time. I even try to avoid the term sin, even though I just said that to you guys. I like to avoid those things because it comes with baggage, and then people often don't understand it. And if they don't understand it, they will check out and stop listening. Additionally, with that, I like to leave out any sort of like name dropping. So if you're presenting your testimony from up front, you're like, yeah, I'm in Jeff's Bible study, and Chris and I were hanging out the other day. If I'm there for the first time and I don't know who Jeff or Chris is, I'm like, I feel like more of an outsider. Therefore, I feel like I don't belong here. Therefore, I want to move away from this group. So we've got to prevent that kind of stuff. Keep the cookies on the lowest shelf, I like to say. Don't put them up high where not everybody can reach them. You got to keep them on the lowest shelf so everybody gets it. Use language and terminology that everybody understands. Little caveat to that might be if you use a term or if you say someone's name, just quickly define it afterward, and then that's okay. That's kind of a way of making sure everybody in the room gets it. Don't assume that everybody knows what you're talking about. That's a wrong assumption to make. Okay, no Christianese. Number 5, have a distinct timeline of a before, a how, and an after you came to know Jesus. Talk about what your life was like before him. When you talk about the how, present the gospel, and then talk about your life afterward. Don't lie and say that your life has been perfect ever since you've come to know Jesus, because it hasn't. It's not true. But have a distinct timeline instead of hopping around to different points in time in your life. It can be confusing and hard to track with someone if they talk about college and then they move back to grade school and then they move to middle school, or they move to when they were a kid and then they move back to, later on in life. Have a distinct timeline. It really helps people. Now, if you're one of those people like my wife who came to know Jesus at a very young age, she became a Christian when she was like 4, 5, 6 years old. She talks about her life leading all the way up to high school when she had a clear understanding of what the gospel was and kind of really committed her life to serving him. And she says, I actually made that decision to accept Christ into my life when I was very young. But now I really understand what that is. So you can point back to that time, because nobody really remembers their life before 4 years old. And it's hard to talk about what a sinner you were back then. So really, you can point back to that when you talk about a time when you've recommitted your life, okay? So keep it short, have a theme, clearly present the gospel, no Christianese or insider language, have a before, how, and after, and 6th and finally, practice, practice, practice. You should have your testimony palmed. You should have it memorized. You should know that thing by heart. And the reason for that is you are not going to be able to pull out a set of flashcards with your testimony on it when you are talking about spiritual things with someone in the shallow end of the public swimming pool, all right? Unless you got them laminated and in your swimsuit for some reason, which is probably not going to happen, all right? You should have that memorized. Know it by heart so that you could talk to people very easily and give your testimony in 2.5 to 3 minutes very quickly when anyone asks about your life or you happen to fall into a spiritual conversation with people, all right? So one last final thing with testimony stuff. It's really not so much about how do I fit the gospel into my story as much as is how does my story fit into the greater story of the gospel. And as you talk about it in that kind of language, it'll really stand in stark contrast to what this culture values and pushes this day of like, it's all about me. When you talk about how your life fits into the greater story of the gospel, what God is doing throughout the canon of scripture and where he's at in history right now, it gives a bigger presence because God's story is more important than our story. And it's not about how do I shoehorn Jesus into my life. It's really about what my life is is fitting, how it's fitting into the greater story of God's redemptive plan to rescue humanity. Right? That's a really important distinction. So all four things are communication makes evangelism less weird. A top 5 list can make it less weird. Making the most of every opportunity makes things less weird. And being able to share your testimony, your story in a very natural way with people can make evangelism less weird. I've found that the better you know the gospel, the more you share it. And the more you share the gospel, the better you know it. As you know the gospel better, you can quickly begin to see that every Christian is a Christian on mission. The call to live your life as an evangelistic follower of Jesus Christ isn't just for the special Christians. It is what we do because it is who we are. I have absolutely no idea why God chose a sinful, selfish person like me to be involved in pointing others toward Jesus. I have no idea why, but I am certainly glad he invited me along for the ride. I hope that these 4 principles, these 4 simple steps have helped you to see that evangelism does not really have to be weird if we engage our common sense and trust God to work in and through us in the process of communicating our faith. Let me end with a quote here by one of my favorite bands ever. It's a band called the Weepies, a non-Christian band that says this in one of their songs. All it takes is a little faith and a lot of heart, sweetheart. I really believe that that's true. A little bit of faith and a lot of heart can really help us in our evangelistic efforts of communicating the gospel to people in our lives. Thanks for joining me this evening. I really appreciate it. We'll see you guys on Thursday night when we do Summer Connect Live. Thanks, guys.